All right. Good morning, everyone. Just some fun chats going on there about Halloween stuff. And Darwin made a really good point about trying to find fun in the new ways that we're doing things. So I love Kiana's PVC pipe to hand out candy at her house. That's pretty cool. Um, and then also some very chubby raccoons wandering around campus, which is also pretty funny. Okay. We'll get started with today's lecture. We're going to be talking about island biogeography. So I'm going to open up my PowerPoints here. Move my screen over. Oh, all right. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. So, sorry, I have to fix something on my display. It's just not quite working. There. Okay. I think that's good now. Okay. So we're going to talk about island biogeography, which is a theory that was put forth by two very famous scientists, Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson. So we're going to talk about these ideas. I also posted their original paper published in the journal Evolution in the D2L folder. You don't have to understand or know the details of that. It's just, it's there if you would like to look at it and see the supplementary sort of support of that paper. You only need to know what I'm going to be talking about on the PowerPoint slides today. But the paper is there if you're interested in seeing more details. It's quite mathematical, but it's really quite interesting to me. Evolution is one of the top most, the top-notch journals that you can publish papers in. So it's neat to be able to talk about these theories that come out of people's research and that are then published in the primary literature. So the point that, there's no specifically required textbook for this course. You can use the Principles of Ecology textbook, of course, as supplementary information, but the idea that the science that we talk about in the course is based in people's, peer-reviewed scientific research. So I think that's to me, that's a very exciting aspect of this course. Okay, so starting off with, you might wonder, why do many more species of birds, for example, occur on some islands compared to other islands? Like the island of New Guinea, for example, up here, it has way more species of birds on it than, for example, the island of Sumba down here. And one answer is that if you look at this relationship that's shown on this graph, along the x-axis here, we have area. Unfortunately, it's in square miles. It should be kilometers if we want to, or hectares if we want to keep it metric. But in any event, we have area across the x-axis, and we have number of species across the y-axis. And these are log transform data so that the line can be made linear. If you remember that from you can flatten an exponential line, right, by taking the log like we did for the whooping crane data a couple lectures ago. Okay, so again, area versus number of species. And you can see that there's this linear relationship that as the area gets bigger, again, linear with log-based data, log transform data, but as island size gets bigger, the number of species, the biodiversity of those islands also gets bigger. So New Guinea and Borneo, have a much higher biodiversity than Palawan and Sumba and Flores, for example. And so there's this relationship between the size of the island and the number of species that are there. We can look at it a little bit more, though, because it's not just the size of the island that seems to be driving these patterns. So it doesn't explain everything, because it doesn't explain, for example, why the Society Islands, all of these islands, Bora Bora and Tahiti and Moria, it doesn't explain why those islands, which collectively have about the same surface area as these islands over here, these Louisade islands, the archipelago of the Louisades, the surface area is about the same of these islands as these islands when you stitch them all together. So area doesn't seem to be explaining the whole story. So for example, the Society Islands, they have a lot fewer species than these Louisade Islands. Okay, so why is that? Why, if the surface area is the same, why are there fewer species on these islands compared to these islands? And then it's also, when you think about the Hawaiian Islands, the Hawaiian Islands, 10 times the area of the Louisade Islands, they have even fewer bird species, as an example of animals. They have fewer bird species, again, than the Louisade Islands. So like the surface area here is like way bigger than it is for these little islands, right? So, it's not just size. There's something else that plays a role. So size of the area is not the whole story. So the Louisade Islands, these guys over here, they're small enough to actually not be shown on this graph, but they're off just the edge here of Papua New Guinea, right? So the Louisade Islands are right here. And then the Society Islands, right? They're way over here. Okay, here they are blown up again. But if you look at where the Society Islands are with respect to where the Louisade Islands are, there's something else that's very obvious. These Society Islands are way the heck further away than these mainland sources here, Papua New Guinea and even Australia, right? The Louisade Islands are much closer. So even though their area is smaller, they are closer to the mainland, so more species can get there from that mainland, right? So that could explain it. So distance is going to matter too. So there's two pieces to that story. So there's surface area that can be colonized by species, but there's also distance of islands from mainlands. And it's the idea that the mainlands are what are providing the source of species that are going to migrate to those islands. So this comes to the theory of island biogeography. So these two eminent ecologists, the late Robert MacArthur, who was at Princeton University, and E.O. Wilson from Harvard, who is still alive, and he's certainly not a young man anymore. In fact, I would, just as a sort of an aside, E.O. Wilson he's very famous for his work on ants and the social ecology of ants. But he's an amazing biologist in many ways overall, and he's written numerous books, and some of them, if you're thinking about like a career in science, he has some advice for young scientists and stuff too in his books. And so if you're interested in that, look him up, Google him, and look up some of his work. There's some really great stuff out there. Okay, so these two together, MacArthur and Wilson, came up with this idea of the theory of island biogeography. In the paper that I posted that's in Evolution, they call it insular zoogeography. But it means the same thing. Island biogeography is just what it's called now. But this insular, meaning islands, and zoogeography, right? The zoo geography, the animals and their spatial sort of distribution. So they developed this idea, this theory of island biogeography, to explain these uneven species distributions. So they proposed that the number of species on any island is going to be a reflection of a balance between the rate at which new species are able to colonize, to immigrate to that island, and the rate at which populations already on the islands are going to become extinct. So there's a balance. They proposed this theory based on this. Their theory is proposed on this idea that there's a balance between new species that can come in and existing species that are going to go extinct. So again, I posted the paper on D2L that's published in Evolution if you want to have a look at some of the more details of it. If you're a mathematically inclined person, you might find it quite interesting. Okay, so what they propose then, again, is that the number of species on any island is going to reflect this balance between immigration and extinction. So this balance between the rate at which new species can colonize and the rate at which populations of established species are going to become extinct. Okay, so again, this immigration and extinction balance. So, for example, if a new volcanic island were to rise out of the ocean off the coast of some mainland that's inhabited by, say, 100 species of birds, some birds are going to begin to immigrate from that mainland to that new island when it becomes suitable, right? So they're going to immigrate across the gap and establish populations on that empty island, which over time, right, it becomes habitable. And so they're going to start migrating over there. And so the rate at which those new immigrant species are going to become established is going to eventually decline, right? Because as each species successfully invades the new space, the new island, it's going to diminish by one the number of new species available on the mainland to come, right? So every time the species goes and immigrates over, that's one fewer new species available left to come from the mainland, right? So again, the rate at which the immigrant species could become established is going to inevitably start to decline because each species that successfully invades the new island would diminish by one the pool of new species available on the mainland still to come, right? So the chance that any immigrant is going to be a new species not already on the island is going to get less and less. as the island gets more and more populated. So similarly, the rate at which species become extinct on the island is going to be related to how many species are already there and available to become extinct, right? How many are already there as residents? So when the island's nearly empty, the extinction rate is going to be really low, right? Because there's very few species there even available to go extinct, right? And there's also still a lot of abundant resources for everybody. So again, when the island's nearly empty, that extinction rate is going to be really low because there's few species available to even become extinct. And because there's few individuals there, there's lots of resources available and there's not much competition. But of course, as you know, the resources will eventually start to become depleted as more and more individuals are there. So the number of resident species, so as that number of resident species increases, the smaller and more prone to extinction through competition, their individual populations are going to become, right? So the rate at which species become extinct is positively related to the number of species that are already on the island. Okay, so the rate at which the rate at which species become extinct is going to be positively related to how many species are already there, because when there's lots of species there, there's lots of competition, right? And so the chance of extinction is going to go up. Again, because the resources are limited on an island, right? So the rate at which additional species will establish the rate at which new species will establish will be high when the island's relatively empty. And then the rate at which resident populations go extinct is going to be high when the island is relatively full, right? So again, the rate at which additional species are going to establish will be high when the island's relatively empty, like at the start, right? When it's just being colonized. And the rate at which resident populations are going to go extinct is going to be high when the island is getting full. Okay. So that's sort of the basic idea. So here's how it looks in a graphical representation. So there's going to be a point at which the two rates become in balance, become equal, right? Where the input from immigration is going to be balancing the output from extinction, right? So there's this equilibrium number of species that would be expected to remain fairly constant as long as the factors that determine the two rates are not going to change, right? So there's going to be this balance. So there's equilibrium number of species would be expected to remain fairly constant, right? So long as the other factors aren't changing, so as long as the two rates don't change. But what's interesting is that the exact species present could change continuously as something goes extinct and a new immigrant arrives. So there'll be this stable number of species, but who those species are can change, right? With this balancing of incoming and outcoming and incoming and outcoming, okay? So the exact species present could change continuously as some species go extinct and others then immigrate and come over and colonize, including ones that might have been there before, went extinct, and then they might come back again, right? So this means there's a steady turnover in the species list, right? So the total number of species remains constant. That's this S value. But the composition of species will change because you have these dynamic processes of immigration and extinction happening, right? And so you have a point where they balance each other, and it focuses on this stable number of species that can be on that island, okay? But again, because the processes of immigration and extinction are constantly happening, this dynamic part of it, you're going to have a change in who the species are that are there. I see a couple of chats popping up, so I'm just going to have a look at those and see if, oops, sorry. What's happening again? I'm having trouble getting to my chat here. Here it is. It's not showing up. For whatever reason on my share screen right now, I can't see the chat, so I'm going to stop.
It's just a picture of a pumpkin that somebody carved. It's not related to the lecture.
Awesome. Thank you for letting me know that. I can check that after because I would love to see it. Okay. All right. So this image, I can tell you, is the crux of the story for the theory of island biogeography. This idea of this stable dynamic equilibrium is the key component of this story. So stable, right? Because the number of species is constant, this S value. And it's dynamic because the species list is always changing. Who the species are is changing because of these constant dynamic processes of immigration and extinction. Okay, so again, that's the crux of what island biogeography theory is saying. Okay, all right, so the theory predicts some other stuff too, right? So I mentioned at the start about differences in area and also differences in distance from mainland. So, for instance, if everything else is equal, distant islands are going to have lower immigration rates, right, from the mainland than close islands, which, that's just based on distance, right? So, and equilibrium is then that S value is going to occur at a lower number of species on distant islands, right? So that equilibrium number of species, that S value on the x-axis, it's going to be lower on the faraway islands because they're going to have lower immigration rates because they're further away from the mainland pool of animals that can come, right? And then if you look at close islands, then they'll have a higher immigration rate because they're closer to that mainland, and then they could support more species. So you could have an equilibrium value, that S value on the x-axis, at a larger number of species. It can be further along on the x-axis. Okay. So, by similar reasoning, then large islands, right? Large islands, they're going to have lower extinction rates. They're going to have more species than small islands, right? There's everything else being equal, which, often it isn't. But if we sort of look at it in this sort of strict sense, the larger islands have a greater variety of habitats. And so then they can hold more species, right? So large islands are going to have lower extinction rates because there's more habitat heterogeneity, there's more space, right? And then small islands, though, are going to have more, going to hit extinction sooner, right? So remember the island example at the start of the lecture, right? A lot of it had to do with distance, even though area was even greater for the more distant islands. There was that factor about distance from the mainland, right? So, the theory doesn't account for some of the issues related to it, right? Like I said, all else being equal, which often it isn't. But again, it's a theory and it allows us to test things, right? It serves as a basis, a hypothesis that we can test. But if you think about it, it's not going to account for everything because different animals are going to have different life histories, right? Like birds can, and different behaviors. Birds can fly. So their immigration, their dispersal rates are going to be quite different than, a small mammal that's only going to get to the island to be able to disperse to the island by some chance event, maybe floating over on vegetation or something like that. So the island isn't explicitly accounting for things that are different about the natural histories and life histories of the immigrating animals. So keep that in mind, right? Again, the idea that, if you think about some different species and what their immigration, that is what their dispersal capabilities are. And that's going to have a big effect on obviously whether or not they can establish on an island. Okay. So the basic model, then, these are the variables in the model. So the first one here, IS, this is the species-specific immigration rate. So this, there's some accounting for that here. The species-specific immigration rate, so this is the immigration rate dependent on the number of species already present on the island. Okay, so the rate at which, again, new species, so the rate at which a new species, those that are not already present on the island. So it has to do with their rate. So the rate at which new species can immigrate. Okay, so that's important about the theory. It's just the new species, the ones that aren't already there. So the number of species immigrating per unit time onto an island that's already occupied by some number of species already there. So that's what this immigration rate is. The immigration rate dependent on the number of species, that S value already present on the island. Okay. And then there's the extinction rate, ES. This is measured in species lost per unit time from the island occupied by some number of species that are already there. So the S subscript in both cases is telling you that it's in reference to the number of species. Okay. And then there's this value, P, the size of the pool of species in the source area, that mainland, that are available to colonize. So this would be, if we're talking about birds and we're talking about the mainland of Papua New Guinea again, and then the Louis Sade Islands as the islands to be colonized, that it's there's this value of P, the number of species that are available on Papua New Guinea even to go over and colonize. Okay, so the source, number of species available in the source. Okay, so the immigration rate is going to decrease as the number of species on the island increases, right? since as S is increasing, there's fewer and fewer new species available, right, to be able to immigrate. So in that pool, there's fewer and fewer new species available. So the relationship then between this immigration rate, the IS value, and S is going to be a negative relationship, right? So it's going to, because IS decreases as the number of species on the island increases. So we're going to have a negative relationship. It's going to be a roughly linear, it's not perfectly linear. It's a roughly linear relationship though, right? The probability of a new species immigrating will be proportional to the number of species that are left to come, right? Right? Because as S increases, there's fewer and fewer new species remaining on the mainland in the pool to immigrate. Okay, so then again, we have this relationship between the immigration rate and the number of species that's going to be roughly linear and negative. The probability of a new species immigrating will be proportional to the number of species that are left in the pool on the mainland to arrive. Okay. So this is assuming that all species are, equally likely to immigrate successfully. That is, that they do all have these equal dispersal capabilities, and we know that that's, not always true. And it also is based on the idea that the actual immigrations are chance events, right? Like I said, floating over on vegetation or something. So it's basing it on chance events rather than accounting for the dispersal capabilities of animals. But there are considerable differences, obviously, in dispersal capabilities of species. And so one way that this is accounted for in the relationship, in the theory, is that this roughly linear negative line, we make it a little bit less linear, and it actually, you'll see it in the next image. It ends up being a bit of a curved line, because those that can immigrate the soonest, those that can fly, they get there faster, right? And then the curve sort of slows down. So it ends up being a bit more of a curved relationship, right? So those with the highest dispersal abilities are likely to colonize first, those that can fly, right? They're going to get there rapidly. So you're going to have a bit of a steeper start to the immigration curve. So they will not only immigrate, the ones that can't fly very well, they're going to immigrate later. And the rate at which they immigrate is also going to be slower because they're not flyers or whatever. They can't get across the ocean to those islands as easily. So then the rate at which species accumulate on the islands is going to be initially rapid, and then it's going to slow down. So it's not this perfectly linear relationship. It's a bit of a curve. And so now you can see that here. So here's the immigration curve here. So it's going to initially be a bit faster, right, for those that are really good at dispersing. And then it's going to taper down, and it's going to slow down for those that are not as good at dispersing. So it accounts for it a little bit, okay? So the steepness of that immigration curve for any island is dependent on its isolation, that is its distance from the mainland. So here's a curve that represents near islands for rate of immigration, and here's a line that represents far, more distant islands for their immigration. So the immigration then is graphed on the relationship from the left-hand side of the figure, right? And it's declining from the top of the y-axis, as I said, as we go down, okay, to the x-axis. Okay, so again, it's going to be this curved shape, because those that disperse the best are going to get there fast, and those that don't disperse very well are going to get there slowly. Okay, so from any mainland pool, the immigration rate will be lower for the more distant islands than for the closer ones. So that's why the light green line is below the dark green line, right? So overall, far islands have a lower immigration than near islands. So we're accounting for that by showing these two examples of a near and a far island, right? That light green line is below the dark green line, meaning that it's lower on this y-axis, right? So far islands have lower immigration than near islands. Okay. So the distance that the distant islands are going to get a species equilibrium that has fewer number of species than near islands. Okay, so if we compare, if we want to, right, we look at where the immigration line crosses the extinction line. So let's just pick one of the extinction lines. We haven't talked about these two different lines yet, but let's just pick one. Let's just use the small line as our extinction line. Okay, and so if we look at where the lines cross, right? So if we look at where extinction crosses with immigration for near islands, you can see here's the number of equilibrium species there, the S2 value, right? But if you look at where the far island crosses, we'll use that same extinction line, you can see it's this S1 value. It's
invite people to join meeting 910.
Oops. It's a lower number of equilibrium species, right? So the far island has a lower equilibrium value than the near island. Okay, so again, that idea that the near island can have more species because it's closer to the mainland, so more species can get there. Okay, the far island is farther away, so fewer species can get there, so the equilibrium number of species is going to be lower. Okay, all right, now let's go to the right-hand side of the figure and look at the extinction part. Okay, see the extinction rate increases as the number of species is greater, right? So we said that as more species are there and available to go extinct, then extinction is going to go up. And at the start, when the island's relatively empty, there's lots of resources for everybody. Everybody's doing okay. And so there's not much competition. And so the extinction rate is low. But once you start getting a crowded situation with more and more species there, then the extinction probability goes up, right? So extinction rate increases as a function of S on the x-axis. So as the number of species increases, there's more depressant interactions, there's competition between species, there's predation, there's parasitism, there's other things happening there. And so that's going to increase the extinction risk. The extinction rate begins, at 0, as I said, when there's nobody on the island. So there's nobody to go extinct because there's nobody even there, right? There's nobody available. But as the number of species accumulate, extinction risk increases. And so also extinction rates increase as the size of the island becomes smaller when there's less space, right? So that's why the dark purple line, the small line, is higher up than the light purple line on the large island. So this is a small island and a large island, right? So on a small island, extinction risk is higher because there's less space. So there's more competition. A large island, there's a little bit more elbow room, a little bit more, habitat heterogeneity. So extinction risk is a bit lower. So that's why the dark purple line is higher extinction risk than the light purple line, lower extinction risk on a larger island. Okay. So overall, large islands can hold more species than small islands. So if we again look at if we cross the lines, we'll cross the immigration line with our two extinction lines and look where we land for the S values. So if we just take the near island line for our extinction. So we'll go on the small island, and where we cross with near, we can see here's the equilibrium number of species, right? But if we go to the large island and look for where the lines cross, there's a greater number. So S3 is a bigger value than S2. So on the large island, there's a higher number of equilibrium species than on the small island. Okay, so you can interpolate those things from the graphs where they cross. Okay, so back to this graph again. So I said, we have all the information, right, about the basic model. So we looked at this already. We're going to look at it again. The model predicts that there's then going to be some value of S, and sometimes you'll see it represented as S with a little hat on the top. So this value, sometimes you'll see a little hat symbol on the top. Okay, and that's the value where everything is in balance, right? So immigration rate and extinction rate are in balance. There's a dynamic equilibrium. Okay, so where those lines cross, immigration line crosses the extinction line, and where those lines cross, that means that immigration is in balance with extinction, and you get to this equilibrium number of species. Okay, and like as I said, sometimes there's a little hat on the top of that S value. So at that diversity on the island, species are immigrating at a rate that's equal to extinction, the disappearance, right? So the new coming by immigration is balanced with the outgoing by extinction, okay? So then we have this balance. And so this results, again, in a constant change in the species list on the island, and that change in names refers to what we call turnover rate, or the turnover. So there's a turnover of the species list, but the number of species is stable. Okay, so again, that's back to that idea of a stable dynamic. And now the other piece of it is that it's an equilibrium. And you've seen this term before when we talked about carrying capacity and the logistic growth, right? An equilibrium means that there's a tendency to come back to that value. If things get perturbed off of that stable value, there's an equilibrium tendency to come back to it. And so I've indicated that here with these arrows, right? So if the number of species on the island goes above that equilibrium value, now the extinction curve is above the immigration curve, meaning extinction is higher than immigration, which is going to send that number of species back down. On the other hand, if you're down here at a low number of species, the immigration rate line is higher than the extinction rate line, higher immigration. That's going to send the system upwards back towards this higher number of species, right? So it's an equilibrium because when the number of species is perturbed off of that equilibrium value, off of that stable value, the equilibrium dynamics send it back, right? So you have a stable dynamic equilibrium. Stable, you have this number of species. Dynamic, the species list is changing because of turnover, because immigration and extinction are constantly operating. And it's an equilibrium because we have a tendency to go back towards that stable value once we get away from it, because on the high end, extinction exceeds immigration. On the low end, immigration exceeds extinction, okay? So it's a stable dynamic equilibrium. Okay, so some tests of the theory. So there's some interesting work that was done. So to test the model, one of E.O. Wilson's students, this fellow, Dan Simberloff, he tested the model using islands, and his islands were mangrove mangles in Florida. I love that term, these mangrove mangles. So here's a picture here of a mangrove mangle. So they're these aquatic trees, basically, that create these mangles. They're like all the root system and branches are all twisted up there. So he did this in the Florida Keys. And so his PhD work, so Simberloff was a PhD student for Wilson. And so his PhD work, he measured the recolonization of these islands following a defaunation. So he encased the mangles with giant plastic bags, and then he sprayed them with insecticides. I don't think you could get animal care permission to do that these days. I'm not sure. Well, they're invertebrates, so maybe animal care committees wouldn't care. But basically, he fumigated these mangles. He covered them in plastic, sprayed a fast-acting, short-lived insecticide to kill all the insects on there. And then he followed the rates and the numbers of the insect species that immigrated onto these mangle islands, and then calculated the re-equilibration of those species. So he monitored it until they came to a stable number of species. And he found that it happened within 3 years of doing the fumigation. So here's the starting point. So here's an example of 4 mangles here. And here's the number of species present that were on those 4 islands. And then on the x-axis here, we have the days after his defaunation insecticide event. So here's the starting point. And you can see that there's this, jumping around and stuff, but generally there's this increase as we move through time, and then it flattens out. And you can see that it's quite similar, right? So the number of species that when equilibrium was reached for this mangle is pretty close to what it was before defaunation. Same with this one, pretty close to what it was before defaunation. Same with this one and this one. So the numbers aren't exact, but they're pretty close. So there's this up and down and going on, immigration and extinctions, blah, 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 happening until at the end of about 3 years, the equilibrium number of species on the mangles was pretty similar to what it was before. It's a pretty slick, experiment to test this theory of island biogeography. So that was one experiment. The next experiment that Simberloff did, he wanted to look at the aspect of area a little more closely. So he did some pretty interesting manipulations in this case. So he censused all the islands again, figured out what the equilibrium number of species was, what that S value was, as a starting control diversity. And then they went in with chainsaws and hand saws and hatchets, and they chopped up each island, each mangle, into smaller islands with gaps of about 1 meter of water in between to create some isolation, right? So again, they went in with chainsaws, hand saws, hatchets, all kinds of stuff, and they split up each island into 2 or more smaller islands. So they're partitioning out the space, right? And there were water gaps of about 1 meter in between each one. And so to the insects, this 1 meter gap was a sufficient gap to prevent crossing from one sub-island to the other during the experiment. So the smaller sub-islands were then censused repeatedly over time intervals sufficient to permit an equilibrium event again, and to find out how species numbers changed with this reduction in island area. So remember, the area census had been part of a previous island, so it contained all the habitats, the structure, the three-dimensional structure, all that heterogeneity was still there. Now all that's happened is the size has been decreased. So all that vertical structure in plants is the same proportions as before, the same habitat heterogeneity. And the results were pretty straightforward, like pretty clear cut. Each island that was reduced in size re-equilibrated at a smaller S value, just as predicted by the theory. So at a lower insect diversity, a lower S value, reflective of the smaller area now of those islands. So Simberloff's data fit that original species area relationship. The area was the key determinant. And so the process of re-equilibration, what happened was extinction, right? So remember, when you get far on that side of the graph, and extinction is over top of immigration. So we're over there now, right? And so a bunch of extinctions happened. So the species that were there in smaller numbers and already susceptible, those guys went extinct. You can think about it as sort of a bunch of mini extinction vortexes happening, right? Like when we talked about metapopulation situations. This theory of island biogeography has a lot of overlap with the idea of metapopulations, right? So again, what happened was extinctions. So the population sizes, the populations of species that were already sort of marginal, in small numbers and already susceptible, those ones, they were outcompeted and they went extinct, right? In this extinction vortex. So we have a reduction in the number of species that are there. Right. And so if you remember the extinction vortex idea, that's when there's already a small number of individuals, and then they interbreed, and then any catastrophe that happens or any big competition that happens, they're more susceptible, and then they're gone, right? It causes, stochasticity from demography or environmental things, probably in this case, demographic stochasticity. And their recolonization is unlikely because he left that 1 meter gap of water between, right? So this is a pretty, this fits the model really well of what was predicted, right? Which is, I think, pretty cool, really cool, actually. Okay, so there's also the work of Jared Diamond. So there are a few islands that have been studied over long enough periods to actually test this idea of this equilibrium with turnover, right? This idea of a stable dynamic equilibrium. So there's this other example of the California Channel Islands. And this, again, is work of Jared Diamond. And so the interpretation of these data, it's had some controversy. Like there was it's important, right? Like we should test these ideas and look at them. But there was a paper published actually in 1980 that examined 25 different attempts to document this turnover at equilibrium in island biogeography. And that sort of review paper, it actually only found that Simberloff's mangrove data that we just talked about was the only study that truly fit the model without any question, right? But anyway, it's like I said, it serves as a hypothesis to sort of look at. So for this work on the Channel Islands, so here, this is breeding bird records. So they were on the islands, breeding bird surveys were done in 1917, and here's the different islands. And here's the number of bird species that were there in 1917. And then Jared Diamond went back and he did surveys. He did follow-up surveys, right? Some decades later. And so he compared these species lists. So he went back in 1969 too. So he did a couple years. But anyway, in 1969, he compared his 1968 data to those 1917 data. And so 51 years between those censuses. And it's interesting because the number of species on the islands remained almost perfectly constant. The turnover was high, like he looked at how the species lists had changed. And that's the replacement of new species, right? So if we look at it here, there's some examples of like perfect sort of balancing here. So in 1917, there were 11 species. In 1968, there were also 11 species. But the list of species changed because 4 went extinct and 4 new ones immigrated. So there was a 36% turnover rate. Similarly, in 1917 and 1968, there were 11 species in both years on this island, And again, there's this turnover that happened. 6 species went extinct and 6 new species came and established. So we have a 50% approximately turnover rate. So it's pretty interesting to, that this document of this happened. And there's some other interesting things here. So again, these are sort of perfect turnover where it's 4 extinct, 4 immigrated. There's other cases where it's not so perfect, right? Here's a 9 extinct and 5 that immigrated. So there's a lower turnover in that case. But what's interesting is the lowest turnover rates are for the islands that have the highest number of species. So if you look at, for example, this fairly low turnover rate here of 25%, but this is an island that has a lot of species, 28 and 24. Similarly here, here's a low turnover rate of only 24%. And this island also has a pretty high S value, right? So this is number of species. So this is the S value. Okay, and here's another example. The lowest turnover rate on the island with the largest number of species. Right? So that's actually that's an interesting piece of the story as well. Okay, and so these data seem to fit that fit the equilibrium theory quite well, right? And so if you look at it, here's some examples of 3 islands with some additional survey data. So the initial surveys here on these 3 islands, and then over time, it's basically flat, right? It's the same number of species, even though that species list has changed. The actual number of species, it's pretty flat across that entire time, okay? The numbers remain almost constant while we know that this turnover happened, right? Based on the species list that Diamond compared to from 1917. So the theory also suggests that turnover should be related to the island area, right? So the larger islands, they're going to have a higher S value, right? They're going to have a higher number of species, as we said. And when there are more species present, there's a greater pool of species, right, that can go extinct. So you would think that larger islands have higher turnover rates. That's what you would think. If you look back, though, that's not what we saw, right? So this island has a really high S value, indicating that it must be a big island, but it has a pretty low turnover rate. So that seems to be like, whoa, how does that fit with the model? So remember, right, as the number of species increases, there's all the competition and stuff that's going to happen in predation, parasitism. So those are going to be more likely to occur. And so extinctions should be more likely as a result. And then the extinction rate, begins right at 0 when there's nobody there, and then it gets higher. This is what we said. So then turnover should be related to also isolation, right? The distance. So turnover should be related to isolation through its effects on immigration. So the more far away islands, right, they have lower immigration rates because it's harder to get there from the mainland. So more distant islands should have a lower chance of immigration, and so they should have that lower S value. And so there should be a lower turnover rate, right, than on islands that are closer. So this, the study found some sort of interesting aspects here. So on this graphic down here, we have the number of species at equilibrium. So that's that S value. And then we have species turnover. And so you can see that there's greater turnover, right, when there's a lower S value. And that's what we saw here, right? There's a greater turnover at these lower S values. And that's what these data are reflecting, okay? So the study found that turnover was inversely proportional, this negative relationship, to the S value, to the number of species. Okay, and so this might contradict that idea, right, that based on island size alone, because in a large area, you should have a high S value and a high turnover. So we can get at this by looking more closely at the graphic again. So when we looked at this graph last time, we didn't look at this, what's happening over here on this axis. So we're going to talk about that now. This T stands for turnover, okay? So, why should this turnover value be related to island area or isolation? So first we'll consider area, and on the next page, we'll look at isolation. So if we think about 2 islands that are equal distance from the source, so we're controlling for distance, right? But they differ in size, they differ in area. So consider 2 islands that are equal distance, right? So we're controlling for distance from the mainland, but they differ in area, they differ in size, right? So long distance dispersal is generally assumed, again, to be a chance event, right? We said that before. This is based on the idea that dispersal is a chance event. It's not directed or goal-oriented, right? The birds don't know they're flying out to a new island. They don't know that new island's there. They get blown out but because they're on wings, it's a bit easier for them to get blown out, right? Okay, so in that case, then dispersal probability and immigration rates to the two islands should be the same. So we can use the same immigration rate curve, right? So area, though, has an effect on extinction rate, right? We know that. The larger island should have higher habitat heterogeneity, as we said, right? And so then there's going to be decreased interactions between individuals. There's less niche overlap and stuff, right? Because there's more habitat heterogeneity, there's more habitat. And so the larger population sizes are going to make chance extinctions less likely. And so then you're going to have a lower turnover rate, right? Again, so large islands should have lower turnover rate because there's greater habitat heterogeneity, then decreased interactions because of that lower overlap. And then larger population sizes making chance extinctions less likely, okay? So these factors then should operate at least in a relative way, independent of the number of species that are present. So it should be relatively independent of that S value. So the extinction curves should have a similar shape, but again, you're going to have lower values for that large island. That's why we have the lower value. The light purple is below the darker purple, okay, for size. So then if we put these comparisons together on the graph, right, and we look at how there's a relationship between the S value and the T value, which is the turnover rate, okay? So we're going to take everything on the near island. We're just going to convert, right? We're doing this independent of distance. We're just going to talk about size here. So let's just use the near island to talk about that example. So on the large island, okay, if you go to the large island and you follow it down, and you can see that the equilibrium number of species is high, right? We said this before, it's S3. But if we take the crossing over to the y-axis and look at the turnover rate, its turnover rate is value T2, okay? So there's the turnover rate, and there's the species number rate. Now, if we look at the small island and do the same thing, right? So you know this already, there's fewer species. The S value is lower on the small island. However, the turnover rate is higher. T1 is higher than T2. So on the small island, it has fewer species, but the turnover rate is higher. On the large island, it has more species, but the turnover rate is actually lower, okay? So it supports Diamond's findings, right? That there's this higher turnover rate, okay, when there's the fewer species. So that's pretty cool. So the other thing, so that's talking about area. So now we're going to talk about isolation, so the distance part. So, you know, why should this turnover rate be related to these things? So why should it be related to isolation? So now we're going to consider two islands of the same size. So we're going to control for size, but they're located at different distances. So now we're going to compare that near-far part on the immigration lines. Okay, so the probability of successful dispersal decreases with distance. As you get further away, it's harder to get there, right? And remember, this is all based on chance events of dispersal happening. So again, we're controlling now for size. So when we have identical sizes, we assume that the habitat heterogeneity, right, it's going to be the same. And, you know, the interactions are going to be the same. So we're going to have the same extinction rate curves, right? So we're going to make that assumption. And so we're going to just pick one of the extinction rate curves. So we're just going to pick the small line to make our comparison. But now what we're comparing is the far and the near aspects of it, right? So again, we'll just pick the small extinction line. So if we look at the near island first, here's the value of the number of species, right? So that S value is here. And here's the T value, the turnover rate. It's the highest value of our scale, right? So this intermediate number of species with a high turnover rate, right? Okay. And then, so if we go with the near, we have this S2 value and T1. If we go with the far, now, right, if we go, the near, and now we're going to go with the far island, okay? And now we have a lower number of equilibrium species, right? And this lower turnover rate. So for the far island, we have lower species number and lower turnover, And in the near island, we have a higher species number and a higher turnover value. Okay. So the farther island will have this lower turnover rate. So again, you can interpolate that just from these graphics and look at where the S and the T values intersect the lines. So that explains what Diamond found in his study. Okay. So this is, again, just a little bit more about the California channel lines. One of the other sort of controversies related to this was that there was this time between surveys, right? There was 51 years between the two surveys. His samples were 51 years apart, which is pretty far, pretty great time frame. So is that the time between surveys seemed to have a large effect also on the turnover rate. So just keeping that in mind, right? So species composition can turn over pretty quickly. And sampling with such wide time intervals, you would miss that, right? If you only sampled those, decades apart. So turnover rates are related to the census intervals. So that's shown here by this graphic. So years between surveys on the x-axis and the percent turnover on the y-axis. So when you sample time periods close together, you see that turnover better. And that goes with this time to equilibrium as well, right? When the surveys are really far apart, then there's less turnover detected because you're missing what's happening over the short term, but everything sort of stabilizes over time, right? So there's this negative relationship. Okay, so those are some tests of the theory. And then there was this natural disaster that provided another sort of test of the theory. So this is a famous natural test of the theory provided by a volcanic explosion. So in 1883, this catastrophic volcanic explosion that devastated the island of Krakatau. Krakatau is located between the islands of Sumatra and Java. So this work was reported on in 1993 by Thorton et al. Here. So, okay. So the flora and the fauna of the remnant and then two adjacent islands were completely exterminated by this volcanic eruption. Okay. So flora and fauna just completely devastated and gone. And also the two adjacent islands were also completely exterminated. But within 25 years, 13 species of birds had recolonized what was left of the island, right? So again, 1883, this volcanic explosion. In 1908, 25 years later, 13 species of birds had recolonized the island. And then by 1919 to 21, 28 bird species were there. And then the next survey, 32 to 34, now there were 29 species there, okay? And so between the explosion in 1883 and then the surveys to 1934, 34 bird species had established, but 5 were known to go extinct. So we had this turnover happening, right? All right, and then by 1951 to 52, in that survey, there were 33 species of birds present. And then by 1984-85 survey, there's 35 species present. And so during this interval of 34 to 35 to 85, 14 more bird species established, but now 8 went extinct, right? So as the theory predicted, the rate of increase, it declined. So initially like rapid colonization, and then there's fewer new species coming, right? So as the theory predicted, the rate of increase declined as more and more species were there. But in addition, as equilibrium was approached, now we see some turnover, right? So in the late, there's 5 going extinct, 8 going extinct. So there's some turnover happening, right? 14 more bird species established, but 8 went extinct. So as equilibrium was approached, there was some turnover in what the species list was. So the number in the cast remained roughly the same, right? About this 34, 35 species. But the actors in that cast, right? The species was changing because of these recolonization and extinction events. Let's see what our time is here. We're good. Okay. And so some ways that this theory of island biogeography can be applied. So it's been applied to many kinds of problems. For example, forecasting how groups of animals like faunal changes might happen because of fragmentation of a previously continuous habitat, right? And that's like the mangle study, right? This intentional fragmentation of those mangles. So for instance, in most of the eastern United States, there's only patches of the once really great deciduous forest that remain now, right? Just patches remain. And many species of songbirds are disappearing from those patches. And one of the reasons for the decline of those species, according to the theory of island biogeography, is that this fragmentation is leading to lower immigration rates because of the gaps, right, between the fragments. because they're getting bigger and bigger and they're not easily crossed. And also the higher extinction rates because of the reduced sizes of these patches as more and more forest is taken out, right? We get smaller and smaller islands of forest. So it doesn't have to be an oceanic island, right? You can think about it in terms of habitat patches otherwise too. So thinking about forest islands within a sea of human disturbance of the environment, right? So there's indications of this type of change in species composition that were found in a habitat study between 1953 and 1976 in this 16-acre nature preserve in Connecticut. So this nature preserve in Connecticut, which was a forest that was reestablishing. So it was set aside as a preserve, and then the forest remnant started to mature, right? So the forest was reestablishing itself. And during that period, development surrounding this nature preserve was increasing, right? And that development was increasing the isolation of this forest patch, right? And was increasing the distance to any more favorable habitat. So really making this more and more of an isolated island of forest that was maturing, right? So increasing the distance between the preserve and other woodlands that might be present. So as the forest started to grow back too, like the forest is maturing in this preserve, species like American redstarts that live in young forests, they colonized the area. So redstarts came in and colonized the area when it was young. And then birds like field sparrows, for example, which prefer open shrublands, they became scarce and disappeared. So we have this turnover, right? Because at the start, it was a forest, or it was a nature preserve set aside that initially didn't have many trees and such, and then it was left to mature as a forest. So initially field sparrows were there because they like open areas, but then as the trees started to move in, different species came. These guys disappeared, and then these guys moved in because they like young forests, right? So again, we see this turnover in the species that are there. So, so then these open shrub species, the field sparrows, became scarce and disappeared. So in spite of the successional trend towards larger trees, though, so, moving to more mature trees, two bird species that are normally found in mature forests, they still suffered some decline. So there's species that would be more, happier in these mature tree forests, but they didn't actually establish well. And then, in fact, they went extinct on the preserve. And those extinctions, so it's a bit outside of the scope of biogeography, but those extinctions are thought to have resulted from competition with invasive species that were there. But also, in relation to the theory, it also had to do with the preserves increasingly isolated. So basically increasing isolation, which is sort of like increasing distance from other woodlots. So it wasn't possible for those mature forest species to get there and establish. But it's an interesting example of a real world sort of example of how you can apply island biogeography to a real situation. There's another example. This is from long-term studies of birds in Surrey, England. So in this, it's an oak woods in Surrey, England. And it also supports this idea that isolation can influence the bird fauna in these islands, right? These habitat islands. So there's a rough equilibrium number here. So there's, the data are shown here. So again, on the x-axis, we have that equilibrium number of species, S, and on the y-axis, we have the immigration and extinction curves, right? And they cross, and where they cross, as you know, is the equilibrium number of species. So here's about 32 species in this oak forest, this oak woods, right? So a rough equilibrium number of 32 breeding species of birds in that community. And what you can interpret from this is that the turnover is about 3, right? So when you remember, if you extrapolate to the y-axis, you can get an idea about turnover. So about 3 species are going extinct and then immigrating over time, back and forth, right? That's that dynamic part. So established at about 32 species, that's that equilibrium value. And the turnover that's happening is about 3 extinctions and 3 immigrations. So the species list is changing. And so it was projected that if the forests were as thoroughly isolated as an oceanic island, it would actually have a much lower S value it would end up with an S value of only 5 species. So it was modeled, what would happen if this was a truly isolated habitat patch. So it's a habitat fragment, but it's got some connection. There's some possibility of movement from other patches that are around. But if we then took that habitat fragment, that oak woods, and we considered it fully isolated as if it was an oceanic island, that's the isolation piece, it would actually have a much lower S value. It was projected, it was modeled that value would only actually be 5 species. So again, remember, S values are much lower when things are further away from the mainland source. Okay, so interesting studies there too. Okay, so island biogeography theory is, it's really helpful to try and understand these effects of habitat fragmentation. So even though the model was originally designed under this idea of islands with like oceanic islands, we can apply it to other scenarios like this idea of habitat fragments, habitat islands remaining for species in a sea of habitat alteration by human activities. So it doesn't, though, address other factors that can really influence things like birds, for example, right? So or any other animals. But there's other things that matter too. And so, some of these things are going to include, like I said, the life histories of animals, like, the speed of their reproductive rate. This is going to be something that's going to have an effect in terms of how their populations will establish and grow, right? Whether the fragment is large enough to contain the territory. So say you have a territorial animal. So is the island even big enough to account for the territory size of that animal, right? And then whether or not the habitat requirements of the species in the pool can be fully satisfied, right? So there's, specific habitats that are required for specific things like, nesting habitat for some lizard species, for example. It needs specific things that it needs to lay its eggs in. So those things would have to be present, right? So the theory is not necessarily accounting for some of these details, right? So if you can take an extreme example, if you think about a grass-covered, treeless habitat, that's not going to be colonized by downy and hairy woodpeckers, which is why I have these guys here, right? If there's no trees there, you're not going to get woodpeckers. They need trees to feed. So even if it was large and both woodpecker species were found in adjacent habitats, you're still not going to get those guys establishing in that island, that grassland island, because their habitat requirements aren't there, doesn't meet their life history needs, right? So just keep that, that's a really extreme example, but it gives you an idea of why you need to think about these other aspects as well. So again, ecological theory is designed to help us think about the real world, but it's not a substitute for the real knowledge. Again, it provides a hypothesis and we can test things that we observe against it to see how well it fits. Okay, so island biogeography is a similar idea. Okay, so I want to come back to this this figure again, this idea that it's a stable dynamic equilibrium. So remembering, right, on the x-axis we have the number of species, and then if you put a little hat on this S value, that's the equilibrium number of species. And on the y-axis we have plotted the immigration rate, and we have plotted the extinction rate, right? And the immigration rate, it starts out really high because some individuals can immigrate really well and they'll get there really quickly, right? They, birds with wings blow over faster than a small mammal on an island of vegetation that might float over. Okay, and then it slows down. And extinction is the opposite sort of shape. They're almost like mirror images of each other. Initially, there's nobody there on the island, so there's nobody available to go extinct. But as more and more species arrive, then there's more and more species available to go extinct. Okay, so the extinction rate goes up, and then things get more and more competitive as well. Where these two lines cross, where immigration and extinction cross, right, and we go down to the x-axis, that is that equilibrium number of species. That's the equilibrium part, okay? So it's a stable equilibrium because it focuses on this value, this number of species. It's dynamic because there's turnover. That is, the species list, the players on that list is always changing because of the dynamics of immigration happening and extinction happening. So new species arriving and existing species going extinct, and then another new species can arrive and some other species will go extinct. So it's dynamic because it's always changing, this turnover part, meaning that the species list changes, but the number of species is stable. We say it's an equilibrium because if you trend away from that equilibrium value, that stable value, if you trend away for it, equilibrium will send it back, will send the system back. Because if you go above that equilibrium, that stable number of species, the equilibrium part is that extinction is higher than immigration. And so all these extinctions will happen to bring the number of species back down to this value. On this side, if you're lower than that stable number of species, that equilibrium stable number of species, you now have immigration is above extinction, so more will arrive until you get back to this value where those numbers cross. And if you remember, you can extrapolate to the y-axis at the crossing point to figure out what that turnover rate is. Okay, so that is the crux of island biogeography. And keeping in mind, so this is the simple graph that doesn't show the two extinction curves and the two immigration curves, but remembering that isolation also plays a role, so distance from the mainland, and also area plays a role, the size. So for isolation, distant islands are going to have lower immigration rates, right? Because they're farther away. So you'll have a lower line on the immigration side here because it's greater distance, right? So distant islands are going to have a lower immigration rate from the mainland than those that are close to the mainland. And so the equilibrium is going to occur at a lower number of species on the faraway islands, right? Close islands are going to have high immigration rates. Okay, species can get there more easily, so there's going to be a higher S value. And then area, where we looked at that in the context of extinction, we had two extinction lines, right? So large islands have lower extinction rates. So large islands, right, has a lower extinction rate than small islands have a higher extinction rate. Because larger islands have more elbow room, more space, more habitat heterogeneity, so there's less niche overlap, so we can have a higher number of species that are successfully there, okay? Versus a small island, which is less elbow room, more competition, more extinction. Okay. So that is the theory of island biogeography. Stop sharing my screen. All right, and so I don't know, can we look at, were you guys able to look at Noah's pumpkin? I'm going to see if I can, I don't know if I can download it successfully to look at it. Anyway, okay, so are there any questions about island biogeography? Or anything else that anybody wants to chat about in the next couple of minutes we have before the lecture period ends? And feel free to turn on your camera and your mic if you would like to interact. And if not, you're free to go if you don't have any questions. But I'll wait a couple of minutes in case you do.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Nice to hear your voice.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi. I was just going to say thanks and have a nice afternoon. I guess we'll see you at the lab, but yeah.
See you at the lab. Try to look at.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah, see you, Lucy.
I have a question about the size of the species pool. In theory, on the mainland, wouldn't there be a point when like so many species have gone to the island that it doesn't make sense for more species to leave the mainland? Because the ecosystem has more space and resources for the ones who are left.
So you're asking about it, Adam, and with respect to what's happening at the mainland rather than on the island? Yeah. So this is where I think a comparison to the metapopulation system is kind of interesting. So you can think about the mainland as the source, right? When we talked about sources and sinks. So at the source, it's good habitat and everybody's still reproducing and birth rates are higher than death rates. You can kind of think about it in that concept. So even though individuals are leaving the island, leaving the mainland to go to the island, there's still lots of individuals left on that mainland to keep reproducing and produce more, right? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, a little bit.
Well, try asking again if I'm not getting at it, or ask it in a different way, maybe. Why leave? Are you asking like why did they even leave the mainland?
Yeah, I guess. And I'm also kind of considering if like the mainland was a closed system too.
Right. So the leaving of the mainland. So one thing that's different about it from metapopulation is that it's not because it's crowded that they leave. It's a chance event, right? So this is again the idea that any dispersal away from that mainland is just kind of a fluke. It either, the birds are blown on the wind or the insects are blown on the wind or other animals might float across. That's kind of the original way that it was created. But the mainland is not, I guess it's almost like a scale. Australia is a bigger mainland than Papua New Guinea. And so is there then a sort of a system where things from Australia go to Papua New Guinea and then things from Papua New Guinea go to the Louisiade Islands? I guess part of my answer would just be it is a theory. So I don't think we can tease apart all the details, but yeah, I'm still not sure if I'm even answering your question. But I think one of the things related to what you're asking is this idea that when the animals leave the mainland, it's not a directed thing. They didn't plan to do it. The theory is based on the idea that that's a chance event.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I have a question. It's a bit more more directed exactly towards you for the lab for later.
Yeah.
I have jaw surgery tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. So we're leaving for Toronto tonight. We were supposed to leave a little bit after the lab, but the weather's starting to pick up.
Yes, I'm looking at the snow out the window, Kiana. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're thinking we're going to be leaving hopefully shortly before it picks up too bad, just since we're expecting a bigger storm.
Mm-hmm.
If is there, in terms of like attendance, I can see if I can find like a hot spot or something to stop to pop into the lab. Otherwise, what do you suggest that I do? Should I just email?
Yeah. So I was going to say, send an email to your GTA and let them know that what you just told me, that you have to travel for surgery and that the weather's bad and you need to go. And you're going to try your best to like attend on your phone while sitting in the car, but you might not be able to, and that's just what'll have to happen. There is an assignment for today's lab that's due by midnight tonight. And that's to create a figure from some of the data you'll be talking about. So hopefully you can, once you get to Toronto, you'll be able to get a connection to actually submit that. But just note all these details to your GTA, and you can copy me on it as well. So we have that on record, and we'll do the best we can to make it work. Right.
Thank you. Absolutely. And is the GTA is it the people that we go into our breakout rooms with?
Yeah. So whose breakout room are you in?
Natalie. I have her tomorrow for another lab too, and she knows because tomorrow I'm going to be very much not at the lab.
Yeah. So just drop a note to Natalie and copy me on it. Okay, Kiana?
Okay. Thank you very much.
And be safe on your drive, and I hope the surgery goes well.
Thank you. Me too.
Hey, I have a question, not so much about like the class material or anything. I was just wondering if you're taking fourth year thesis students with everything that's happening.
So for next year?
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, that's a silly question on my part. But so I have decided that I will accept 2 fourth year thesis students for next year. And I think 4 people have written to me so far, and I haven't accepted anybody specifically yet, but I have some appointments to talk to people about their ideas. So I haven't decided who yet I would take on. And so if you're interested, Sam, one of the things I would suggest is to think about some ideas about what you would like to work on, and sort of get those together and send me an email with some of those ideas. And then we'll think about, so this is, I don't know if I will put you on the spot here, but you need to have at least a 75 average to take the fourth year thesis. So you have to make sure you meet that requirement first. Yep. And then, and if you meet that requirement, then you can, send me some ideas about what you'd like to work on, and then we can maybe make an appointment to chat about stuff. But I have 3 fourth-year thesis students this year, and it's too many. I'm having a hard time keeping up with what they're doing with all the other shit going on, to tell you the truth. Like, it's just, and plus I have 9 graduate students right now. So it's too much. Everybody needs a little bit more interaction right now, and it's hard to keep up. And I don't want to do that to a fourth-year thesis student. So that's why I've decided I'll only have 2. But I want to pick 2 that I know I can work with. That's a project that we're both interested in, that kind of thing. I don't want to just take the first 2 that comes. I'm being a bit picky, I guess. Right. And the reason for that is to make sure it's a good mentorship experience.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And so who's in the tank behind you?
That would be Cleo. She's a ball python.
Did I ask you about that in the lab?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, she hatched at the zoo that I work for, but she wasn't doing too hot as a little baby. So I got to take her home to kind of nurse her back to health. And
so are you with Little Rays, or who do you work
yeah.
with? Which one?
Yeah.
Hamilton or the other one?
Hamilton.
Hamilton? Nice. So you've probably, I've had other students that worked at Little Rays in Hamilton that have done fourth-year thesis in the lab too. So is she a baby now still, or how's she doing?
Oh no, she's 4 years old now. She's almost 4 feet long. So she's getting
Cool.
there.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I have a what is she? She's a Pueblan milk snake, a Mexican milk snake, and her name is Gummy. So a year ago, so more than a year ago now, but April a year ago, security at LU contacted me because they found a baby snake under a desk in the dorms. And
Oh, wow.
Course, you're not supposed to have pets in residence, right? Even a snake in a tank you're not supposed to have it. So they found her curled up under a desk in the dorms, and it was during exams. So they had to, somebody called, there's a snake, so they went and got it. And then because I'm the herpetologist, they contacted me and they're like, we have this snake at security. We don't know what to do with it. And I said, well, I'll take it. I mean, I'll hold on to it, and I'll ask around if it's somebody's pet, and eventually give it back if they want it back. But otherwise, I'll fall in love with it and keep it. And so that's what we did. When I went over to security to see it, it was really funny because she was just like, a
little baby,
a brand new baby. So, escape artist for sure. But she would, when I went over to security, they had her in a gummy bear plastic bin, which is why her name are gummy worms. And that's why her name is Gummy, because she's also very colorful striped. She's beautiful. The colors on her are spectacular. She's red and black and peach colored. Mm-hmm. She's just really cool. She's an apricot Pueblan milk snake.
Oh, so pretty.
Yeah. And so we've had her now for a year and a bit, and she's on this massive I don't know if you even care about it. Anyway, she's on a massive eating frenzy, and she's like almost 3 feet long now. And it's just amazing to look at her. She's just this gorgeous little snake. So I'll have to bring her to lecture one of these days so everybody can see her.
Please do.
Yeah. She's amazing.
Milk snakes are some of my favorites. They're super, super pretty. So many different variations.
Yeah, and it's weird to me that, technically she's the same species as the one we have here in Ontario, just a different subspecies, but her body morphology is totally different. She's got this pointy little head and these little beady eyes on the front. Like, she's just really different looking. Anyway, she's pretty cool.
Oh, well, thanks for sharing.
You're welcome. Anyway, snake stories. We got to tell our snake stories. Anyway, yeah. Okay, so think about what you'd like to work on. Send me some ideas. Like, do you still have access to... do you still go to Little Rays? Like, do you still?
Yeah, I'm working on the weekends right now.
So, one of the things that I've done with people that work at zoos like that before is try to make use of the animals you have access to and collect some data. We did a project. It was with Little Rays, but it might have been the Ottawa office, where the student looked at the body condition of snakes that worked versus snakes that didn't work.
Alex Binns.
Yeah. Okay. So you know Vince.
Yeah. I used to work with her when she was still at the zoo.
Yeah. So that was a really neat project, and it was useful to the folks that run Little Rays because they want to know if their animals were, tired of working.
Exactly.
Basically. So we looked at their body conditions. I don't remember what the outcome of the study was because it was enough years ago now that it's all a wash. But anyway, so, there's things like that. If you have access to animals and there's a question that your bosses at Little Rays are interested in, then that's an even better idea, right? I would like it to be an explicit project like that. That's my preference for sure. And something that's useful to your bosses. So there's a zoo here, and there's a zoo in town here. Are you here or are you in Hamilton?
No, I'm in Hamilton at the moment.
Yeah, okay. So that wouldn't help. But there's Northern Exotics, and they have a zoo here. They're on Kathleen Street here in Sudbury. I don't know if you ever went there.